I used to think when I cleaned my bathroom, I had to clean everything. And that's a sense of perfectionism, right? It had to be this huge monolithic thing to do, as opposed to, why can't I just clean the sink? And oh, if I just do the shower, it's just 10 minutes of me doing the shower, as opposed to, an hour or two to do everything. I've learned to break tasks down. When I look at a room, I don't have to clean the whole room. Maybe I just pick up my laundry right now. Hello and welcome to Divergent Paths. I'm your host, Dr. Regina McMenemy. I am a doctor, but not that kind of doctor, and this is a podcast, not medical advice. Have you always felt a little different but didn't know why? Have you struggled with tasks that some people seem to handle with ease? Are you mystified by social norms and interactions? Divergent Paths is a podcast for late diagnosed neurodivergent people to discuss their journeys discovering the joys and frustrations of having a spicy brain. Each episode, I will interview someone who discovered they have ADHD, autism, or a combination of the two later in life. What defines a later in life diagnosis? Anytime the realization happens outside of the quote-unquote norm of childhood and adolescence. We've mentioned a few times that people with ADHD and autism often face issues with executive functioning. But what is executive functioning, and how does it relate to having a spicy brain? In this episode, Russ and I will explain everything you need to know about executive functioning. So stay tuned, and thanks for listening to Divergent Paths.
Why don't you just tell me what it is? I'm just going to cut right to it. Just what is it?
Executive functioning.
In these terms.
Executive functioning is the phrasing for how we make decisions. So whenever you make a decision in your life, any decision, and that could be wearing a black t-shirt versus wearing a blue t-shirt, that is you using your executive functioning.
Is it though?
Yes.
Because I'm just grabbing the same I have
thing.
like 20 black t-shirts. Right. And I just grabbed those. It's sort of like the Steve Jobs things. Like he would just wear the same thing because he didn't want to think about it.
Right.
He just wanted to get in and just do something else. Right. So is it executive functioning that I'm doing that? Or is it just like, okay,
you're still choosing to get dressed?
Oh, okay.
So like
touche.
Yeah, that's still you could not put a shirt on. But let me ask you this. When you get dressed every day, do you get dressed in the same order? Do you put the same things on in the same order every day?
I don't think so.
Right.
I just kind of do. Like, it's whatever is.
Is it an automatic process? Do you go to get dressed and do you think about it? Do you think about it's cold out today, so I'm going to put warmer socks on or anything like that?
Sometimes. And then I make wrong choices. I guess maybe it's I don't want to make choices in the morning. That could be the problem.
Right.
The other day I chose to wear pants instead of shorts because I thought it was going to be cold at night.
Right.
And then I suffered all day with pants being hot. And then it turned out it wasn't cold at night. So I was just hot all day. So that kind of sucked.
Yeah.
So it is much easier if I just don't even if I go on autopilot and think about it.
Right.
So actually that's a question. Like, what's the difference between is a person actually going on autopilot when they say, oh, I'm just on autopilot, just doing the tasks, checking off the things.
Right. It depends.
Is that autopilot?
I mean, yes. And in some cases it is. In some cases we have done things so many times. Like I get in my car and I do not consciously think about putting on my seatbelt.
Right.
Because
I just does.
I just do it.
Right.
But there are very few places in my life where that happens, where I just am in a situation and I do a thing. One of the only other ones I can think of is when I swap my laundry out, I don't think about cleaning out the lint trap. I just do it. It just happens. I don't think about it.
Yeah, I don't think about it, and that's a problem because I don't do it.
If you don't think about it and you don't do it, then it's a problem.
Yeah, that's a problem.
But I don't. That's one of the only things. every other moment in my life, I am making an active choice to do something. And that is, from what I understand, now I cannot speak from having a neurotypical brain because it is not how I function. And like I said, this podcast is talking to people who also have neurodivergent brains, and work in this way. So when I brush my teeth, I have to make an active choice to brush my teeth, to pick up my toothbrush, to put the toothpaste on it, to brush my teeth. It is not an automatic process for me. There is no autopilot that runs for that. So I have very few instances of anything that I do through the day that runs on autopilot. And this is a good kind of metaphor for exactly why executive functioning ends up being a struggle for people with neurospicy brains. Because when you don't have the runway ready to go and you don't have, there isn't anything like, there's no rails taking you on it, there's no anything like, and you have to stop and you have to make a decision at every moment of every part of your day, then that is a drain on what is, for everyone, neurodiverse and neurotypical as well, a limited resource. We all have a limited resource of decision making. I remember many years ago, long before I had any inclination that I had ADHD, I had traveled to see friends about 6 hours from where I live. And I'd driven, and driving is not an automatic process either. Really is something, and especially on the long drive. Like I love a long drive. I love loud music, and driving. That's a nervous system reset for me. Playing loud music and singing in the car is one of the ways I know I can reset my nervous system. But I was tired, right? I was fatigued from the drive. And I get there and they're like, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I don't want to make any decisions. I just don't want to decide. I will very unlikely be unhappy with whatever decisions to make, because we had to decide if we're going, where we're going out to dinner, where we were going to, all of these steps. And I just said, I just don't want to decide. You pick. I don't care. I know you're going to probably pick something I'm going to enjoy. So just pick. So that was my executive functioning was depleted at that point.
There's a comedian that does a joke that I love that I just heard the other day. He said, I'm so excited that they're opening up a new restaurant in town. It's called I Don't Care, You Decide. So now my wife is actually picking restaurants. That was a joke, but it's interesting. Many times there's a lot of people that choosing a restaurant, sometimes, whatever, you're going out for a lunch thing with somebody and you've got 3 people and you're all sitting there like, oh, you decide. Nobody's making a decision.
Right.
I get a little frustrated with that sometimes.
Sure.
And I'm just like, okay, I'll decide.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know. I feel okay about that.
And if you're in a social situation where you're not feeling responsible, or if you are and everybody's just pushing it off, and you just are the person that's the as one of my former coworkers would say, the one with the band hammer who just comes down and says, this is what we're doing,
right? Right. So I often wonder though, I am just making the decision, and it's almost like when you're around people that are not making the decision and you just say, I'm doing this, it almost feels like, it's the Reddit board of am I the a-hole?
Right.
Because you feel like, oh, well, I'm kind of an a-hole for doing this. But it's actually, I would think, especially if you're dealing with somebody that doesn't want to do these decisions and you just make the decision, you could probably feel good about that. Right.
Right.
But also, I guess on the other side, it's you've got to say, you know what, I really don't care.
Right.
I really don't.
And you have to, and the people participating who say that have to really not care.
Right.
Because if they do care, and if this is an intimate relationship, if this is a romantic partnership or your wife or your husband, and they say that, but they do care, and then it like fosters resentment. That's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, that's I think there's podcasts there for that.
There is potentially a podcast, and maybe, you know, a podcast we can do is like, after we kind of do this, like establishing what executive function is, like what's the damage that having executive dysfunction can do to you, right?
Yeah,
And can
because
do to your relationships.
where there's functioning, there's dysfunctioning.
There's dysfunctioning, right? Yeah,
What,
and that's
talk about that.
right. Well, and that's what there is for people with neurodiversity and with ADHD and autism is, that is one of it's not a diagnostic. Wow. It's not a diagnose. Fuck. Save that for the outtakes. Yes, thanks. Executive dysfunction is not a diagnostic criteria for ADHD. It is not, or autism. It is not something that they're looking to measure. But because of the other functions that they look at in your brain and how your brain works, it is often the outcome of it. So because you know, I have a brain that is constantly taking in more information than it can process. So I experience an onslaught of information constantly, right? And being able to prioritize and differentiate and choose what is important in that is really hard. And because one of the diagnostic criteria of ADHD is struggling with working memory, which was one of the things that in my assessment was really low, my working memory. Working memory is your capacity to just keep in mind what's happening. So often this plays out for, I miss things. My brain is slow to catch up. So I will say, and not realize that my brain is just half a sentence behind what you've said. The person I'm talking to will start to repeat it. My brain will click into the original time they've said it.
Right.
And then I answer as they're repeating it. And they're like, "What?
That wasn't a moment."
Right. Exactly. Like, where did that come from? Well, that's it. That is part of the dysfunction that people with neurospicy brains will experience.
I used to work in radio, and one of the things with radio is there's a ton of stuff going on at the same time, right? Like, well, now, you know, it's all just run by a computer and it's robots. But back in the 90s, early 2000s, it was still, you know, push button. You're putting on the next song. You're picking out the music. You're picking out the commercials. You're paying attention to what you're saying. You're reading cards, and you're taking in information, you know, sometimes in your headset as you're talking.
Right.
So super like multitasking, right? You're thinking about 10 different things at once.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, driving, right? Like, I mean, you know, you're taking in all of this, you know, data coming in. You're listening to loud music as well. You're thinking about, you know, where you're going. You're thinking about like all these different things.
You're thinking about the cars. You're looking for, you know, things that might happen on the road. Yeah. Yep.
So I know that some people say, you know, multitasking is not great. Sometimes, you know, like that there's a pushback against multitasking, but I still think there's places where it's just going to happen, like the car, or like in, you know, like in a work situation. Sometimes you just have to do that, like a doctor, and, you know, like in the emergency ward, like you've got to deal with multiple things coming in. So how do you, with your neurospicy brain, handle multitasking?
Not well. Well, I shouldn't say that. It really depends on how much of my reserve of executive functioning I have left. I can multitask. I was thinking of it, you know, we were preparing for this episode this morning. I was preparing to get my daughter out the door for school, which is a multi-step process. You know, there are lots of different things that she has to do. There's lots of different things I have to do. So you know, there's a rhythm to this. And I thought about it because there's this meme, and, you know, at least a TikTok video, if not a meme that I've been sent by several friends in the last few weeks of like walking into the kitchen in the morning, and it's got a video of somebody like walking into the kitchen and kind of like looking around and like trying to like figure out like what needs to be done or whatever. And then they just like scream, and I think they might swear in the video because it's like a TikTok sound. But anyway, that and the text says, you know, walking into the kitchen and needing to decide what to do first. You know, like what is the priority, right?
Mhm.
And so this morning I had a really smooth morning. So I have been making a pasta lunch for my daughter. So I have to boil water, you know, to make the pasta for her lunch, right? I also put on my kettle so that I can heat up the thermos that I'm putting it in so it will stay warmer for her, you know, whatever. So these are two things that you do that are passive, right? That just need time to be done, right? You just need to start the water to boil, right? So in the ideal setup, I remember to do that first, because then I can go make her breakfast while the water boils for her lunch, right?
Right.
Now, there are mornings where I will start making the breakfast and forget to put the water on, and that puts me behind in time, right?
Right.
So like this morning was one of the smoothest mornings we've had, in part because like she's had the same things. We're now a few weeks into school. My practice has gotten a little better where like I know, okay, these are the steps I need to take, and I've got more of a pathway for what setting up for breakfast and making your lunch and stuff looks like, you know. So that's the kind of example, like remembering to put the pot on to boil water first when you're making pasta versus if you are making dinner, starting the sauce or whatever else, whatever other things like you might be doing in conjunction with that. Knowing that order and kind of like putting those things in order is one of those examples.
So hearing this, it also sounds just like time management.
There is definitely, yes, time management is an executive functioning. And along with that, and we can do an episode on this later, people with neurospicy brains tend to have what's called time blindness, where both we will get lost in a task. If we're doing a task and we're in hyperfocus and we're like getting lots of dopamine from that thing that we're doing, we would completely lose track of time, right? I've talked about that before, forgetting, you know, bodily functions, forgetting other things because you're so into this. But in addition to that is the experience of not recognizing how long it takes to do something. So obviously thought about this a lot this morning after I dropped my daughter off, and I was back in the kitchen again, and I was cleaning up the dishes from making breakfast. I was thinking about, I was making myself a cup of tea, and I have been putting off taking the dishes out of my dishwasher because in my head, my ADHD had made this monolithic task, this huge thing, all these dishes I needed to put away. So I hadn't done it because it was this big thing. So my tea was steeping and I had 4 minutes. So I'm like, how many dishes can I put away in 4 minutes?
Without breaking them.
Right. Without breaking them. And how much of this can I get done in this short period of time? And I was able to not quite get all of it done, but I was able to get a significant enough amount so that when I go back out there for lunch, I won't be annoyed at the fact that the sink is full of, dirty dishes, because not only did I get the dishes put away, I got the dirty dishes put in the dishwasher, right, in that 4 minutes. Because it really wasn't that big of a task, but my ADHD brain that sees all of these possibilities and all of these things stacks all that into every task. So even though it's just take the dishes out, put them away, and put the dirty dishes in, less than 4 minutes.
Right.
To do the majority of it. In my brain, it was this huge list of things that I needed to do. And the space I was in the last couple of days, I wasn't in a place to be able to focus on it. So I had left it. These dishes have been cleaned since, 2 days ago.
Well, that's good because now they're not hot when you take them out. So
right. They are definitely.
I hate that.
Yes, I know.
That.
Yeah. So I can multitask sometimes, but it is a struggle sometimes too.
Okay. So how do you like structure a task so that you can get through it without distractions?
That's a great question. Um, this is probably something that I struggle the most with.
Okay.
Because breaking down tasks into their steps, it takes a lot of executive functioning.
Right.
It takes a lot of that limited pool of being able to do things. So, for example, I've been making bread. You know this because we've been talking about this. I've been making bread, and I'm kind of late to the making bread party because I didn't catch on in 2020 when everybody was doing
Right.
it. So it's a few years later, and I'm on the train of making like homemade bread. And I bought a bread machine because it does all of the kind of annoying work of the bread. And when I go to make a loaf of bread, I have now taught myself to think about the fact that making a loaf of bread dirties only a bowl and 2 measuring spoons for me. That's all it takes for me to be able to measure out, and 1 measuring cup, and for like liquids and stuff. And this is all it takes for me to be able to do this. Like it's not this huge thing. Again, like I'm trying to break things down. So whenever I go to make it, I just remind myself, you're not going to have a big mess to clean up, because making bread like can be very messy, can be very intense, right? The bread machine cuts out a lot of the work of that, and I don't have to have like bowls and etc. or whatever. I just throw it in its thing. But breaking it down and like reminding myself that there's not going to be a whole big mess to clean up to do this. It's just this short amount of time for you to measure out these ingredients, put them in, put it in, and then it runs for like 3 hours, and then I pull it out and I bake it in my oven, right? So that's a shortcut. That's part of how I break the tasks down into starting to think about how small can I make this task seem. So I know some coaches that help people like create spreadsheets so that they remind themselves that like emptying the dishwasher takes 5 minutes. Putting the dirty dishes in the dishwasher takes 3, like, whatever it is, so that you start to teach yourself some of that time management so the tasks don't seem as big. So I guess that's definitely one thing, trying to make tasks seem the actual size they are as opposed to the big one. Another thing that I've done is like, I used to think when I cleaned my bathroom, I had to clean everything. Like I had to clean the shower, I had to clean the sink, I had to do the floors, I had to do the toilet, like all of it. Like I couldn't, and that's a sense of perfectionism. Like I had to do all of it, right? It had to be this huge monolithic thing to do, as opposed to, why can't I just clean the sink? And if I just do the shower, it's just 10 minutes of me doing the shower, as opposed to, an hour or 2 to do everything. So that's one of the other ways that I've learned to break tasks down. When I look at a room, I don't have to clean the whole room. Maybe I just pick up my laundry right now.
Right. I would think so. If you were, if you're a parent, if you're managing somebody, let's say, in a workplace, that could also be something that I would assume they could do to help the person that they're working with.
Absolutely.
To just, instead of saying, do this gigantic task, breaking it down into steps so that they're getting one piece at a time.
Yeah. And helping with the prioritization, like what needs to be acted on first. If you give someone who has a spicy brain a huge project and they don't have the understanding of what is important, when and why, they might run into something called decision paralysis, which is where you have run out of executive functioning.
Right.
And you cannot decide.
Right.
And paralysis is terrifying.
Right. And well, and if you recognize this and you're able
Mhm.
to break these things down and help them out to get to that point, you're going to avoid that and get whatever project or whatever task, big
Mhm.
task, done because you've broken it up into those smaller steps.
Yeah.
And I would assume that as now, I'm asking this in this kind of workplace thing, but it's
Yeah.
also you can apply this to yourself as well. I'm just thinking in this like management kind of way of thinking, because I host the DIY for Business podcast, which
That's
I
right.
just plugged.
Thank you.
But the thing that I'm thinking about is, okay, you've set up these subtasks, you've prioritized, and you've made it so that it's a nice little path. You're also doing check-ins along the way. Are you
Mhm.
like rewarding along the way? Are you like, is there positive feedback along the path? Like, what does
Yeah.
that do? And that's, in dealing with another person. What about in dealing with yourself? Like, are you doing that for yourself as well?
I do now, yes.
Okay.
And I did, like, when I was working on my dissertation and I was trying to finish, my PhD, which I come back to a lot because I did a lot of accommodating back then and didn't realize that I was accommodating my ADHD. Um, and I used to joke that I celebrated everything. Like, I celebrated because I wrote an outline of a chapter. I celebrated because I finished an interview with somebody. I celebrated because I finished a transcript. I celebrated every time I finished a transcript because the transcripting was awful. There was no auto process like there is. Like, there was no AI that was helping with
Right.
transcripts back when I was doing that work.
Right.
It was me with my computer and replaying sections of text over and over again, because this is a scientific process and you need every little and ah in that transcript. So everywhere I could, I would celebrate. And I still have a good portion of that. Like, I will reward myself with, you know, 5 minutes of scrolling on TikTok because I finished cleaning the shower, whatever it is. And with some of those care tasks, with things that I have to do around the house to take care of myself, like taking care of the shower and cleaning the shower, how it means the next time I go to take a bath, it's going to be a nice experience because I'm going to be in a clean shower versus me looking at the bathtub going, this is gross. I don't want to take a bath. Right.
Right.
And so I try
Right.
to remind myself what's on the other side of the unpleasant task that might be enjoyable.
So, okay, we're talked about tasks. Now you just brought up, your dissertation and going through, that huge process. How did this impact your learning style? Like, were there
Mm.
differences in the way that you were taking in information? And, you know, what adjustments did you make?
When I got my bachelor's, it was in literature, and I had studied, a lot of dead white men writers. My master's degree was the same. I studied modernist writers, and that's who I wrote about, T.S. Eliot and William Faulkner, for my master's thesis. And when I finished that, I was like, I am so done with dead
Mm.
white guys. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. And so when I went into the PhD and I thought I was going to write about superheroes, because my first topic was going to be me writing about Wonder Woman and Buffy and all these female heroes that I was in, that I loved and I still love. Um, one of the changes as I was in that program was I don't want to write about, you know, other people's writing anymore. I want to actually talk to people. I want to write about people who I'm interacting with. And so just that alone was part of my process. Like, I felt like I had learned so much about understanding the human experience through all of that literature that I had read and all of those stories and all of this beautiful writing that was what I fell in love with. Like, and I still love and still read plenty of fiction and still love all kinds of things like that. But I had come to a point where I didn't want to be looking at that anymore. And I think that was part of maybe the special interest had kind of fallen away, that I had a bit of a hyper focus on just reading things, and I needed it to shift focus. And so that's part of what I did, is I shifted focus from, text to people. And so just that is part of how like my learning process came. And one of the reasons why I am doing this podcast is I want stories to be told. Like, I want people to have a space to tell their stories. And I think the fact that we have so many people recognizing their neurodivergence at these later points in their lives, and how rich and interesting and fascinating their lives are, and sharing those struggles so people who are undiagnosed can figure out. It was a very empowering process for me to get diagnosed. It's not always that way for everybody. Not everybody feels that way about getting a diagnosis. And the more we talk about it, the more normal it can become. So all of that is part of my learning process, and how I have kind of modified my life to my spicy brain.
I don't know if I should ask you this, because it's a big decision. Should we end the podcast here?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that was a really good moment to end the podcast on. Thank you so much for listening. Do you struggle with executive functioning, decision paralysis, working memory? Share your experiences with us on Instagram at Divergent Paths Consulting, no spaces. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, like and leave a review, and share with your spicy-brained friends. Or sometimes share with your non-spicy brain friends so they can learn and understand more about executive functioning. And until next time, stay spicy.